My name is Peter Osborne. I chair the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. Thanks very much, everybody, for first of all sitting down and allowing us to start the conference as quickly as you have. But thanks, everybody, for attending as well. Can you pass on to anyone you know who is on the waiting list still for the conference our apologies that we weren't able to fit everybody in? But I think the fact that there was such an interest in this conference and so many people who wanted to come, but we just couldn't accommodate the numbers, I think it shows how important these conversations are now and in times going forward. So if you know somebody who wanted to be here but unfortunately was told there's no space, please pass on our apologies to them that we've already done. I have to do a few things before we start the conference. One of them is the usual housekeeping, so you know where the gents and the ladies are out there, turn to the right. And I'm supposed to give some instructions on what happens if there's a fire drill. There is no plans for a fire drill, so if you hear the fire bell, just get out. That's my instruction, as quickly as you can, and keep yourself and other people safe. I want to say a few thanks as well. Can I say, and we'll be doing this through the conference, a thanks to all of our sponsors for our lovely breakfast, as well as for all of the other events that we're having during the course of today. They'll be named as we go through the conference, but to all of them, our thanks for helping to make this conference what hopefully it will be as we go through the day. Can I say a particular thanks to other sponsors, to Dublin City University and Queen's University, without whom the Centre for Cross-Border Studies wouldn't have started and wouldn't exist today, to the board members that they helped to appoint, amongst other board members, who make such an incredible contribution to the work of the Centre as well. QUB and DCU are at the heart of these conversations with the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, as is the board members, and thanks personally to the board members for supporting everything that the organisation does. Can I also particularly thank the staff, because I won't get a chance to do this at the end. A conference like this doesn't just happen. It takes a huge amount of work, and with a very small team at the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, the staff there just do an incredible job, not just putting on this sort of event, but many, many other events during the course of the year. And can I say on behalf of the board to Anthony and everybody else in the team, a really hearty thanks for all of the work that goes in to putting this event on, but to the many other events that the Centre does over the course of a year. Can I highlight Leah? Over in the corner there, Leah is going to do a visual minute of the event. So I shall strike a pose, and can I just say to you to pay attention. I suppose go and have a look at what Leah is putting together during the course of the session. If you want to take photographs or stick it out on social media, that's absolutely fine as well. Have a chat with her, see how things are going with her. And if you are doing something on social media, if you could use the hashtag CCBSConf, or let me spell that out, hashtag CCBSCONF, standing for conference, obviously. And please do use it if you are doing social media, because it allows the Centre and the rest of us who do social media to see what's said and repost anything that you've said in your social media channels. Well, depending on what you said, of course, but hopefully repost it. It's great to see so many people here. I'm distracted by the Letterkenny people who have sat not just close to the exit door, but close to the bar. That's what you expect. And the other people close to the bar are the Armagh people down in the corner. That's what you expect. A bit of cross-border cooperation close to the bar is what we want during the course of the day as well. It'll open later, don't worry. It's 25 years since the Centre started. It's a heck of a long time. It is, in a sense, a child of the Good Friday Agreement. And in that time, over those 25 years, the Centre has engaged with thousands, and maybe even tens of thousands of people having the sort of conversations that we all know are so important to the future of this island, north and south. But I think what strikes me about the work of the centre is not just a centre that looks at doing studies or facilitating research. It's a centre that asks the so what question about that research. Yes, we need to have robust research, but the so what question is so important as well. It's a centre that has been about practical activities, practical actions, and practical cooperation north and south as a result of the work that it does. In other words, looking at the mutual needs, the mutual interests, and the mutual benefit of cross-border cooperation on this island for people of all backgrounds, all opinions, north and south, east and west. And I think it is important to reflect on that in its 25th anniversary and the work that has gone on over those 25 years. So the conference is partly about looking back, but the most important part and the largest part of this conference is looking back to go forward and what does the next 25 years hold for the centre, but more importantly for people on these islands, north and south, east and west. It's not quite a reconciliation paradox where you look back at a painful past to improve and make a better future. But it is important to look back, to understand those challenges of the last 25 years, to really appreciate, to truly appreciate the opportunities of today and the opportunities of years to come. That's what the conference is about. And that's why we want not just to hear from the speakers that we hear from, but to have the important conversations that we'll have, not necessarily for the Letterkenny folk at the bar, but that we'll have over coffee and the different breaks that we will have during the course of the day. Please do talk to each other as you know and as you will do. I know when we hear from the senior UK representative, can I say who it is yet, Anthony? Well, there we go. We'll have a senior UK representative later in the day, and I know he's going to be open. I've given the gender away to questions and answers as well. So please do have a think about those questions as we are in a context of resetting relationships. Oh, I've probably given away a little bit more there as well. So thank you everybody for coming. Let's have a good conference and let's have these conversations about the future of relationships, north, south, east and west, where there is mutual interest and mutual benefit. Can I start the conference off then with our first panel? Our first panel is going to be chaired by Caitriona Mullan. Caitriona is a senior expert with the European Commission, DG Regio and the structural funds, an advisor to the Association of European Border Regions, including AEBR in Ukraine, and to the International Centre for Local and Regional Development, amongst many, many other things. I could go on for 5 minutes, Caitriona, about your experience and knowledge. The most important thing is Caitriona is an old friend of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. Caitriona is going to take us through the next part of the agenda. Caitriona, thanks very much indeed, and you're very welcome.
Thanks, Peter. I realise I should have sat closer to the podium. You're very welcome, everyone, and I have to say it's lovely to see a table from the northwest. Not just Letterkenny, Peter, it's Derry too. Just be careful what you say. We have a way of getting things done. Yes, you're all very welcome. The first thing I have to say this morning is that unfortunately the Centre's founding and first director, Andy Pollak, is unable to be here, to his great regret. So I want us all to, I suppose, just start by giving Andy a round of applause for being the first director. And then to say that Dr. Helen Johnson was probably surprised to get a call from me about 40 minutes ago asking her where she was. But Helen has agreed, as a former chair of CCBS, to step in and to join the panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is to ask the panel to just take their time in taking their seats while I now introduce the video from Waterways Ireland. Waterways Ireland obviously are one of the North-South bodies, or Waterways Ireland is the sponsor of this panel. So I think this is the point where I step back and let the video play. So we're going to have a discussion with Helen, who's a former chair of CCBS, and Ruth, Dr. Ruth Taillon, who's former director, and Dr. Anthony Soares, who's the current director of CCBS. So on this panel, you have a vast institutional memory of the entire lifespan of CCBS. So I'm going to come to you first, Helen. You've obviously been, as I understand and recall, so I think we're all trying to leaf through our memories of the last 25 years this morning. You've been chair across all 3 directors' tenures, and you have an institutional perspective not only on the current period for North-South cooperation and studies, research, but the original setup and the environment. What would you say about how the environment for the work of CCBS started out, how it has evolved? What were the kind of challenges and events that changed that environment and that CCBS had to respond to over time?
Thanks, Caitriona. Maybe before I answer the question, if that's okay, I'd just like to say that during the lifetime, the 25 years of the Centre for Cross-Border Study, we've had 3 chairpersons and 3 directors. So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Chris Gibson, who's with us today, who was the founding chair of the centre, followed by myself and then by Peter Osborne, who you heard from this morning. And 3 directors were Andy, who was introduced earlier, obviously Ruth, and then Anthony Soares. And you're quite correct that when I took over as chairperson of the centre, Andy was the director at that time, subsequently followed by Ruth and Anthony. And so obviously I'm just really disappointed as well that Andy can't be here, because he really set the tone, I think, for the centre. And he was a great person for writing, for research, for networking. And I think that has continued throughout the time of the centre, as said by Peter earlier. So I think those are relevant in terms of thinking then how we responded to the changing environment, which was the question you asked. So that was in 2011, I took over as chairperson. At that time, there was a lot of energy around North-South cooperation. There was a lot of interchange. There was a lot of interaction with the North-South Ministerial Council, who are also very important to the work of the centre. But that then changed. At the time, it was followed after the economic crash in 2008, but the implications of that really only happened, 2011, 12, 13 at that time, because up until then, we had Interreg funding, which was really important for the centre. It helped us to deliver North-South projects, but also it opened up I think the view and the work of the centre to a European dimension, and I'm sure Ruth will talk more about that later, because Ruth led a lot of that work. So that was really important, but then subsequently it was a lot more difficult, because when the Interreg funding stopped, it was more difficult then to get more funding, because the exchange between the North and the South suddenly started to stop. There's a lot of cutbacks and budgets, etc. So people were then, rather than doing their own work and looking across to network and so on, were constrained in how they could do that. For example, I remember whenever I took over as chair, there was a training course, for example, for senior civil servants from the North and the South. And they came together, and the centre facilitated that. And that was a really useful networking opportunity as well as a learning opportunity. Of course, when budgets are cut after the cutbacks, that had to go by the wayside. So there was a lot more inward looking, and so a lot less opportunity for cross-border cooperation. However, the centre did continue. We still held our annual conference. We still produced the annual booklet. So I think that has continued right throughout. So we continued to work, but in a much more difficult environment. And it was much more difficult, as well as I've talked about the various senior civil servants and so on. It's also very difficult, I think, for community groups and people working on the ground, because a lot of their budgets were cut as well. So that was a very challenging period, followed then subsequently by Brexit. which of course, we're about a cross-border cooperation and peace building, and suddenly then the nature of the border changed. I can say a bit more about that in a minute, but the whole Brexit discussions were quite challenging, and the Centre, I think, played a leading role in providing information around that. And certainly they were called upon by people in the north and in the south in terms of the implications. And maybe just to have a call out as well for border people, and Anne-Marie O'Kane is here, because right throughout that period it was such an important resource, the Border People website, which has been developed. It was providing a good resource in terms of information north and south before the Brexit, but then things started to change, and I think it's been an invaluable resource since then about the implications for people working and living one side of the border, living on one side and working on the other, and vice versa.
Sure. Thanks, Helen. And in terms of, I suppose the one thing I'm just thinking about, you referenced that training course. I think legacies are sometimes filter through in different ways, and there is obviously the masters, the masters that in public sector leadership that's delivered by Atlantic Technical University and UU, which I think might have picked up some of that torch for a current generation of public servants, north and south. In terms of your current role, obviously you're a senior research analyst with National Economic and Social Research Council. You've been heavily involved in a lot of the wave of north-south sort of scoping research that was done to support the Shared Island Initiative in its first couple of years in terms of an evidence base for needs on which then decisions could be based. In terms of, how north-south cooperation may need to evolve to meet the challenges that are in front of us all, what would you say about the role of evidence in that process? How important is it?
Well, being a researcher, I'm going to say the role of evidence is critical, but it is really, and I think that's being more and more recognised now as well. I know some people say that it's not, but whenever you look at what's happening in reality, people are using the evidence. And for example, even through COVID, that was such an important thing about how we would respond to the pandemic, which none of us had experienced before, to use the evidence. So just to think about what happened in terms of putting the Shared Island in place and the role that the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, evidence and research played in that. Right throughout its time, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies has engaged with different layers of society. I think that's important. I've already referenced, the government department officials, but we've also engaged with businesses, with the trade unions, and then with society. And I think when we thought about the Shared Island Initiative, even though budgets had been cut, Brexit had taken place, and what I said earlier, people were maybe looking more inward. Actually, at those different levels, there was still, especially at the business level and the community level, that interaction was still taking place. And that's really what the Shared Island is a bit about. How can we collaborate and share for the benefit of everyone? So it's about documenting what's already happening and building on that. And I think the Centre has done that right from the outset, so it's an important resource in terms of even using the evidence in terms of building up the Shared Island. They're very much aligned.
Thanks, Helen. Ruth, I'm going to come to you, because you joined as director 2 years before Helen took up chair. You had both, in a sense, come from that sort of a similar field, which was that sort of interface between economic and social research. And Ruth, you had been steeped in the application of the structural funds in Border Action, Hubble, what was prior to that ADM, Combat Poverty Agency.
It's even longer ago.
Yeah, I'm showing her age. I suppose for you, you came in at a point when obviously the crash had just happened. What was the impact of the financial support from the structural funds for the work and the development of CCBS? What was the impact of, for example, Interreg 3 and 4, really?
Yeah, well, there were the two packages that we got from Interreg, which made a tremendous difference. I think probably the most significant thing was it put the centre in a kind of a different level of being able to be a practical resource for other people, like civil servants and local authorities and community workers. So it was a very good way of being able to combine, for instance, Border People was one of the projects that was funded, but it was a package of kind of interrelated projects, and which were also interrelated from the first round of Interreg funding to the second. So, for instance, we had the Bradley Best Economic Report in the first round, and then that was followed by the work that Maureen and Philip did in terms of the Border Development Zone. And that actually, I think, had quite a lot of resonance, except that it kind of got derailed by the reorganization of local authorities. And so a lot of the work that we were trying to do by getting that adopted by different local authorities kind of got sidetracked a little bit by them having a huge reorganization. But it also then allowed us to do other things like build, I think probably one of the things I'm most proud of is the Impact Assessment Toolkit for Cross-Border Cooperation, which, again, that project was the first time we were in partnership with the Euro Institute in Germany, which I'll go on probably to talk about it soon. But that toolkit then led to a lot of training with local authorities. We did some really interesting projects helping other groups. I remember Donegal County Council, for instance, who had a package then of applications and projects that they were taking forward. So we did a lot of work with them, taking them, helping them refine what they were intending to do and using that methodology. And the toolkit was then translated by some of our colleagues in the Catalan region. It was taken on by the Taillon network and used there. So, you know, it had a lot of resonance. And after that, then we also then had a package, which I think Anthony may or may not talk about, where he did then another couple of toolkits that complemented those. So we're trying to do both the research, which we consider very practical, but also then to be a real resource for people and a support to people. Oh, and I should also mention ICLRD, which yourself was part of, the International Centre for Local and Regional Development based at Maynooth. They had a big package of activity of research and training for local authority people as well. So I think it really put us into a slightly different league at that stage in terms of what we could do, and it was really important because our funding, which was a bit of a handicap in some ways, but we couldn't have done without the European money substituted for the fact we weren't getting money from other places, for which I have never forgiven them. So it was very important, and it's unfortunate that things kind of dried up at some point.
Sure, so I'm going to come back, and again, you're talking about legacy. I think sometimes also, practitioners in the field will actually tell you that those things like the cross-border impact, the kind of the influence on thinking, did sink into local authorities. You can see the imprint of some of that work coming through years later in things like, the cross-border work that the local authorities are doing continue to do along the border. Coming back to the Euro Institutes, because I know we've obviously got Tevenet who's speaking later, and we also have Beerta and Martin here, and there's a network of people interacting on this stuff across Europe all the time. You mentioned that partnership with the Euro Institute and with the Taillon network. How did that come about? I know you've referred to it a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I know you were instrumental in really making that link happen.
Well, we started with the relationship with Joachim Beck and Sebastian Riem, who was our first intern, who came from Germany from the Euro Institute. And that was to work on the Impact Assessment Toolkit. So that was the first project and started there. The Euro Institute then took the initiative to set up a network of cross-border practitioners. And again, it was a really significant combination of people, for instance, university professors, people who were doing sort of quite high-level research, and also then people like ourselves who are working with grassroots communities, and people, our partners on the Polish-Czech border, for instance, who are also doing a lot of work with local authorities and people on the ground. So it was a an amazing sort of opportunity for cross-fertilization, for learning. It certainly is important, I think, in taking us into the European, and I think we benefited from that when Brexit came along, because we had several years then of actually working at a European level, dealing with European institutions, finding out all about that, but also learning. And I think one of the things about the Taillon Network, I was thinking about this the other night, we kind of described ourselves as, 12 border regions. Some are old borders, some are new borders, some are, emerging from conflict borders. And we were selling ourselves on the emerging from conflict borders. And then one time, Marie Hughes, who's our former finance person, and I were at one of the Taillon workshops, and Slovenia started talking about the conflict they'd had in the former Yugoslavia. And we kind of just looked at each other and thought, okay, that puts ours in perspective, So I think it was very good for us to have that sense of putting your own work in a bigger context and seeing how you fit and what you shared and how you differed, and maybe put our little situation maybe in the perspective in terms of the European context that it kind of merited. But it was such a good learning experience and such good cooperation. And I think really did give us, we had the contacts then in the European institutions and stuff, so when Brexit hit us, we were actually, I think, in a really good place to be able to do, which I think, again, was some of the most important work probably we did. It certainly consumed my last years at the centre in terms of just dealing with the implications for our island and all of that. So the Taillon Network, I think, was really a hugely important thing for the centre to get us out of the very inward-looking thing that I think we tend to get into sometimes about our little island.
Indeed. Ruth, I think you've already talked about what the biggest challenge for the centre was. Well, several of them really. I mean, resourcing was one, obviously. Then what was happening in the wider environment with the advent of Brexit, and that real benefit that maintaining those European policy and research networks had for the island as well, and for those people who are actually dealing with the negotiations on the ground. What are you most proud of as a director about your time there? What's the thing that you would say, that's the thing if I have to pick one thing that I'm most proud of?
I think probably was taking the work into the European context, which was not always, it was a difficult balance, and I probably am guilty for maybe focusing too much on that. But I think it was important. I think it really changed kind of the whole context for what we were trying to do. And certainly in terms of the balance where you had a lot of people who were also working on cross-border cooperation, who thought cross-border cooperation was important, who had lots of fresh ideas. And then when you sort of were struggling with some of the people here, it kind of made things a lot more encouraging, let's say.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Anthony, I'm going to come to you. So you're currently the director. I know organising these events is the thing that preoccupies you, but I'm going to just ask you to come into your director headspace and just tell us a little bit about what, since you took over as director, what have been the major challenges for CCBS and in the environment that you're working in?
Well, we've mentioned it before, but I suppose the biggest challenge was Brexit. As mentioned, we did a lot of work in terms of during 2016, in terms of kind of setting out potential implications. I think pretty objectively, let people make their own minds up. But when I actually became director, it was actually dealing with the aftermath, what the vote actually meant, and those years of negotiations. And one of the challenges really that we had was in terms of, this is going to sound really nerdy now, Article 11 of the Protocol/Windsor Framework, that commitment to maintain the necessary conditions for continued North-South cooperation. I think the challenge that we had is we weren't sure that either the UK government or the Commission actually understood what the necessary conditions are for continued North-South cooperation. It's very easy to say that, but to actually understand what are the necessary conditions. I remember looking at the mapping exercise that the UK and the EU did of North-South cooperation and kind of listing 140 odd areas of cooperation and looking at how reliant they were on EU regulations or whatever. And I just remember talking to, Ruth was still director at that stage, so this was just before I became director. Us talking to ourselves and looking at this grid, all these things boxed in, and we were going, that's not how North-South cooperation works. North-South cooperation is about people moving around. You can't box these things off. And that has been a real challenge ever since then, is trying to make sure that those who are responsible for dealing with the aftermath, that they actually do have a grasp of what the necessary conditions are. Because for us, there's kind of four broad areas that we would say. One is the political context. So we've seen, during my time as directorship, that real seesaw of, London's relations with Brussels or with Dublin, Belfast and Dublin and Brussels, real seesaw in that. And that does affect the context in which North-South cooperation happens. The community context. The political sometimes has an overspill into communities in terms of how they look at North-South cooperation, depending on what the political leadership is saying around the situation. And then obviously the material context. And obviously a lot of the focus is on trade and barriers to trade, but it's a fact that organisations that are involved in North-South cooperation, they need goods to actually operate. So if they have difficulties in accessing goods, then that's a problem, and also services. One of the kind of challenges that we notice is that we don't want to scare people. We don't, especially not community organisations who are involved in North-South cooperation or are thinking about it. We don't want to scare them unnecessarily. But, for example, the fact that Northern Ireland, and the rest of the UK obviously, is not in the single market for services, that has consequences. So whereas goods might be able to flow reasonably freely between Northern Ireland and the EU, we're outside of the single market for services, that has consequences. That means that there are certain obstacles to North-South cooperation, and sometimes organisations aren't even aware of those consequences until they actually hit them when they have to do something. So that was a challenge. And then the other area, obviously the regulatory context, changes to rules, regulations, legislation. And with that, it's also the challenge about how people look at these negotiations and the protocol stroke Windsor framework. We had a real struggle. Some people had this expectation that the UK and the EU would go into a room and within a week, there it is, protocol done, that's it. And we constantly tell people it's a process. It's not something that is going to be done next week or next month. Or it is an ongoing process, and we have to keep looking at what that means in terms of North-South cooperation. So that's been a real challenge. And just the other one that I would mention then in terms of a challenge, I'm not sure whether Ruth felt this or Andy, it's just sometimes the perception that some people might have about cross-border cooperation, that it's somehow linked to some kind of political agenda, whereas we know, working with people, whether it's business, local authorities, community groups, they are doing practical cross-border cooperation because it's a mutual benefit for their communities. So that's been another challenge.
Sure, and I think it's worth also acknowledging that actually local government is one of the areas where Strand 1 continued uninterrupted for the last 25 years, precisely because cross-border cooperation was seen as being part of the practical concerns of daily life for many people along both sides of the border. Coming to that issue of the conditions for North-South cooperation, I mean, we know, looking back to the 90s, that the Europe of the Regions agenda played a very strong role, for example, in our own peace process here. it's arguable as to whether, if the UK hadn't gone into a process of devolution, would it have been so easy to establish an executive in Northern Ireland and so on. We also know that the conditions for particularly the details on Strand 2 were laid by civil servants writing to each other for 10 to 15 years before that all happened, identifying practical areas for cooperation across the whole of government. So in that sense, I mean, the supporting pillar that came out of the 1998 agreement for the work of the centre was one of those very, very strong domestic drivers. The other driver for the work of CCBS has obviously, particularly given that relationship with the Euro institutes and the engagement with the European institutions, has been European cohesion policy as an ongoing frame of reference for what it is needs to be done. And I suppose arguably, I mean, again, this is, we've transitioned to being an external border of the European Union. It doesn't mean that cohesion policy doesn't still matter. And I suppose the question now for us is, particularly because of the challenges Europe is facing, it's not so much what Europe can do for this island, it's what this island can now do for Europe in terms of contributing and demonstrating in small ways what cohesion policy means for stable borders. What's your view on how, do we need to get back to understanding the role of cohesion policy and how that might affect how we, for example, reform North-South cooperation in the future?
Absolutely. I think the centre had, well, still has to some extent, two central pillars in terms of the way it approaches all of its work. One is obviously the Good Friday Agreement, but the other one was EU cohesion policy. And then obviously now we're in a situation where Northern Ireland is, well, it's kind of out, although we do have Peace Plus, is a European territorial cooperation programme, so we still have that kind of link. But yeah, we've lost many of the links that we would have had previously. But we're talking about North-South cooperation and East-West cooperation as well. It's about cohesion. It's, cooperation is about cohesion in terms of making life easier for people on either side of the border, doing things that make sense for mutual benefit. That is cohesion. And to my mind, it makes no sense at all to kind of say, well, we're no longer in the EU, therefore we don't have to bother with the EU cohesion policy anymore. It's got nothing. We're not relevant. It's not of interest. It is of interest. There are things in terms of cohesion policy and the way it's being practiced in other border regions that we can learn from, but we can also, there's things that other border regions in the EU can also learn from us, and that's going back to Ruth, we're talking about the Taillon network, the Transfrontier Aero Institute network. That's what that network is about, sharing, learning, and that network has a real interest in cohesion policy and the direction of cohesion policy going forward. And we have a contribution to make to that as well. We shouldn't think we are no longer linked to cohesion policy, no longer have an input to it. We have a real voice there, and we should use that voice in terms of sharing what works well here, and also continue to learn what's working well in terms of how cohesion policy is being rolled out in other border regions in the EU.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we remain in the neighbourhood. Particularly in the UK and Northern Ireland, and there's certainly an opportunity, I think, as to how we do that, which is actually can be quite inspiring for other places as well. I'm going to ask you, Anthony, first, and then ask Helen and Ruth just sort of for a final word. For the future of cross-border cooperation on this island, if you had to pick one priority or keyword or emphasis that you wanted people to understand was a priority, what would it be? I'm going to ask Helen and Ruth the same question, or ask them to answer it. You've got a bit more time.
Well, that's a huge question. I think for me, it's capacity for cross-border cooperation and understanding that it's an ongoing learning process. And it is a skill around doing cross-border cooperation. It's not something that you just fall into. So I think what I would like to see is at all levels, whether it's government departments, officials within government departments, whether it's local authorities, whether it's community organisations, is to understand that when you're doing something that is cross-border, it is not the exotic fruit, it's not the add-on to your more important work. If you're doing cross-border cooperation, if you're doing a cross-border cooperation project, it is because it should be in line with the core mission or whatever your organization is. Therefore, you're doing your core work. It just so happens in this instance you're doing it on a cross-border basis. So I would like to get away from this thinking that the cross-border is that, it's that exotic thing that one or two people in our organization do. The rest of us don't have to worry about it. No, you all need to know about it because you are doing your core work on a cross-border basis.
I think that's a really good point, Anthony. I think as well that, if you look at, again, back to sort of the European perspective, 30% of the European population lives in a border region. So the importance of that embedded approach, not as an ideological thing, but actually as a way of reaching the whole territory effectively and releasing its full potential. I think that's an important thing that I know, cohesion tools are what I work with all the time. So that is one of the big challenges. How do you actually get to embed these processes and thinking and capacity across the whole of the domain of public administration? Helen?
Yeah, well, for me, it's about relationships. So I think if you can build relationships, you can then understand as well, because you're networking with people. You can understand other people's, or helps you to understand other people's points of view. If you're building relationships, you can then use evidence as well to try and make good connections. And I think that happens at all different levels of society. If we can do that at this political level, at senior official level, local authority level, very important, across then the social partner structures, community level, employers, trade unions, and so on. But also then the more vertical relationship building and connections as well. So it's not just communities talking to communities, it's communities talking to local authorities and to senior officials and so on. That builds understanding, and when you have understanding, when somebody can lift the phone to somebody and say, I've got this problem, have you come across that? How did you sort it out? And that's really what it's about. We all live in this one island, on islands, north and south and across, and wider Europe we've heard. But if we can appreciate where each other are coming from, build those relationships, we can come up with better solutions for the benefit of everyone rather than pulling against each other.
Sure. So capacity and relationships, vertical, horizontal, and network-based, and all of those things that help to achieve change and capacity. Ruth?
Well, I suppose I'm a long time retired, so I can say what I think.
Please do.
I think one of the most difficult things for the centre over the years, and I'm not sure what the funding situation is now, but has always been the lack of northern public financial support. And for a long time, the European money kind of replaced that, and then we hit a crisis because it wasn't there. There's always been this kind of, among certain powers that be, this assumption that cross-border is a slippery slope. And so there's been political opposition to it. On the other side of the coin, which we're very much in the public debate over the last few years, has been the constitutional question takes priority. And somehow cross-border cooperation and practical work on the ground is seen as kind of slightly wishy-washy, or maybe not so important as the big constitutional debate. And so we've kind of lost that thing. Centre was always made very clear it didn't have a position on the constitutional question, but the practical work on the ground at all levels between public sector bodies and community bodies was very important. And an axe I've been grinding since 2006 was the St. Andrews Agreement, which ditched the Common Chapter. And the Common Chapter, I mean, we're seeing it, I think, with the Programme for Government in the North now. The Common Chapter always had, every policy document had to have a paragraph committing itself to cross-border cooperation. And because it had that, then you could, that was a benchmark, and you could hold the public servants, and in fact, I mean, all the southern departments at one stage had a cross-border coordinator. All of that seems to have disappeared, so there's no targets and timetables and no specific resources for cross-border cooperation. And so then, of course, it is treated like a luxury, and you lose that whole momentum. So, and people don't feel empowered in their jobs to be able to give it a bit of priority and do it because they're so tied up with survival and trying to do what they see as their core jobs. So I think we really need to regain some of that. And I know I'm probably talking to the converted in this audience, but I think it's really important that discourse changes a little bit and we start, let's say, what are we doing practically? And I think that's one of the things the Centre has been so good at, is combining the evidence with the practice and working with practitioners on the ground at all levels. So there needs to be a lot more of that, and it needs to be supported by things like the Programme for Government.
Sure. And so that sort of whole systems capacity, perhaps a bit more performance frameworking stuff to actually help to make it happen, investing in leadership, kind of work that CCBS has done, ICLRD does, getting back to the effect of the Common Chapter without the Common Chapter, would that be where we need to go?
Bring back the Common Chapter.
Bring back the Common Chapter. Well, certainly, this has been really a great pleasure to moderate this panel. I feel like I haven't had to do very much because everything was made so easy by CCBS. And I know that you'll all be looking forward to all sorts of conversations over the next, well, not quite 24 hours, but certainly today and this evening. And I know we've got an awful lot more depth to go into on certain issues. So I know I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the day. It's always great to get chairing over early in the day and you can sit back and relax. But it's been a real pleasure. Can I ask you all just to show your appreciation again for Ruth and Anthony? Thank you very much. Can I ask you all just to stay in your seats for a minute? I've one more thing I need to do, which is to introduce the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, who can't be with us in person, but who has sent a video greeting to the conference today, presumably from Belfast. So I just wanted to, again, just wrap up the session. Now we'll hear from the Northern Ireland First Minister, Michelle O'Neill.
Jadí Bharja, I'd like to pass on my congratulations to the Centre for Cross-Border Studies as you mark your 25th anniversary. In the decades that have passed since your foundation, our world has undergone many dramatic changes. Yet challenges that arise from divisions, whether geographical, political or social, still remain. It is in this context that the work of the Centre is still relevant when we bring together communities, academics and policymakers from across this island. We create new networks of understanding that will transcend divisions. Looking ahead, we face significant challenges: climate change, economic disparities and social inequalities that know no borders. It is only through continued cross-border collaboration that we can tackle these issues effectively. As First Minister and joint head of the four-party executive, I am only too aware of the importance of working together, of collaboration and of partnership. North-South and East-West cooperation is absolutely crucial to how we deliver better outcomes for all of our citizens. The Good Friday Agreement opened the door to new possibilities and to new opportunities for peace and cooperation. Our people are always best served when all of the institutions and all of the apparatus of the Good Friday Agreement are working, including on a North-South and East-West basis. The North-South Ministerial Council plays a key role in that cooperation, dealing with a wide range of key areas such as infrastructure, health, education and much more. For me, the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the North-South bodies is a perfect opportunity for a refresh in all of these areas of collaboration. Working collectively through the institutions, we can help build a better future for the people who live across the island of Ireland. It's also important that we have good East-West relations and a healthy working relationship with the British Government. The Executive is happy to work with all partners, North-South and East-West, to improve the lives of our people. And we await with interest proposals from the Prime Minister on a Council of the Nations and Regions. We look forward to building a positive relationship with the new government in London and enhancing the already established and close links that we have with Edinburgh, Cardiff and Dublin. But it's not just about what happens on these islands. A good relationship between the British Government and the EU is also important. Our closest neighbours are EU member states and they are important partners for us in terms of trade and investment. We have long-standing links through education, research, culture and the arts, as well as through our diaspora. We have a particular interest in this relationship given the role of the British Government and the EU in terms of the Windsor Framework. Our staff in our Brussels office, with their access to colleagues in the Irish and British governments, as well as key decision makers at the most senior levels in the European Council, the European Commission and the European Parliament, have an important role to play in supporting this relationship. The role is also key to ensuring that the Executive's position, as well as that of civic society and business here, is understood in the EU. It is important in building mutually beneficial relationships and links with the European countries and regions. Currently, the Executive is facing significant challenges, but we are committed to tackling them head on. We have just launched our programme for government, which is being published for public consultation. Our draft plan incorporates the Executive's priorities: developing a globally competitive economy, making childcare more affordable, reducing hospital waiting lists, tackling violence against women and girls, improving services for children with special educational needs, building more social and affordable housing, and stabilising and transforming our public services. I am well aware that this is not an exhaustive list of things that the Executive needs to tackle, and I know that a particular area of concern is the barriers faced by cross-border workers who face obstacles and challenges as part of their daily lives. The Executive wants to reduce those barriers as far as possible. The Centre for Cross-Border Studies plays a key role in raising awareness of cross-border mobility issues and signposting to advice services, and I really want to commend the Centre for its work. Not all of the issues faced by workers can be dealt with by the Executive and the Assembly. Matters such as banking and taxation, for example, remain reserved, but we will continue to work with all relevant partners and agencies across these islands in an effort to tackle those barriers and challenges. There have been huge strides forward in North-South relations over the past 25 years, and the North-South bodies now provide many of our vital public services on an all-island basis. Cooperational initiatives across healthcare, education, the environment, infrastructure, the economy and other sectors are all making a real and positive difference to people's lives. Looking to the future, I believe it's important that we examine areas for further cooperation to further improve the lives of all of our people. So congratulations again to the Centre of Cross-Border Studies. I know you're a small team, but today's event is testament to the wide range and reach and the impact that you have. I trust that everyone at today's conference will find it informative and helpful in building those cross-border working relationships which are so vitally important. I want to wish you well for the rest of your conference. Gurmila Mayagov.
Well, thanks very much to the panel. What a fascinating conversation. Thanks, Caitriona, and everybody else in that panel, taking us back and looking at the present and the future challenges. And can I also say many thanks to the First Minister for recording that message and that positive message from the Northern Ireland Executive as a whole. We appreciate it. I said at the start a thanks to our sponsors, and I want to say something else on that. The funding of the organisation and what the organisation is able to achieve is dependent on that funding. And I see Gina here and potentially other work around the EU Special Support Programme for Peace Plus as it is now. And let me just say, people don't realise this. The peace programme started in Northern Ireland and the border counties in 1995. Within 12 months of the ceasefires, the EU put its money where its mouth was in terms of supporting peace and reconciliation on this island. When Peace Plus ends, it's going to be a third of a century of investment in peace and reconciliation. The EU has a stake in our peace process and has delivered in terms of supporting that peace process. When we look as a centre for support from DFA, we're proud to be a strategic partner of the Department for Foreign Affairs. But more than anything else, the centre does its work because of support from the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. We are so grateful for the support that department gives the centre. This conference and the work that the centre does in supporting and facilitating research, and more importantly supporting and facilitating cooperation, north, south and east and west, it's instrumental in providing support for that work, and we really do want to express our appreciation to the department for what it has done and is doing and will do for the work of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. That's why it's such a delight to be introducing the next speaker, Minister Patrick O'Donovan. Minister Patrick, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be here today. Patrick was elected to the Dáil in 2011. You must have been a child when that happened, Patrick. Before that, Minister was Fine Gael leader in Limerick City and County Council and has taken over the department from an illustrious predecessor. You've got a lot to live up to in terms of where your next move, Minister, but we're delighted that you're able to make it here today. Thank you very much. Please give a warm welcome to Minister Patrick O'Donovan.
Gur míle maithagibh agus ar dús bhfuilm má bhuíochas a gháil díobh asachtan cura chun bheith I bhór meascan seo I nún algan ar maidin le haig an cógáil seo in aig stadéir trastóran agus sé anhabhdachtum mar ara brisidachas agus ardadachas ólaíochta nuolaíochta agus taide chun bheith an seo ní amháin ar mo sun féin but ar freisin ar sun an rialtas. This is a very important occasion for me, not only on behalf of myself and the department, but on behalf of the wider government and the wider administration. And I'm delighted to see so many partners that are here to mark something that is really, I suppose, for people of my generation. And I'm flattered by the suggestion that that I'm somehow a kind of a Dorian Gray, but I'm not. I remember growing up in the 80s, and I remember growing up in the early 90s and what this country was like. And I remember coming through Dundalk ever before there was such a thing as the M1, when my aunt was a sister of Nazareth in Belfast, and the odd time that we got to go anywhere, it wasn't to Fuerteventura anyway, and certainly it wasn't to Fair or any of those places that Ryanair take us now. It was to a place that for a young fella from West Limerick may as well have been in a totally different universe. And we had no idea, even though we're just down the road, we had no idea what was happening here in this town or what was happening just up the road over the border and the impact that it was having. But we heard about it every morning on the radio, I suppose, as somebody who was transfixed by politics in the 1980s in this state, in this jurisdiction. You couldn't help but listening to Today Tonight and Brian Farrell, and then in Morning Ireland, it was a case of where had the latest atrocity occurred. And as children going to school in West Limerick in the 1980s, while we weren't subjected to the atrocities and we knew nobody, it was something that really kind of bookended the start of our day and the end of our day every day. What's happening in the north today and how many have been killed. And when my aunt used to come on holidays from Derry and from Belfast, where she was in a convent, she used to bring the usual amount of summer presents. Nuns in those days didn't get, I suppose, the stipends that they get these days, but whatever few bob she used to get, she used to spend it on us, on pencil cases and things like that. And one time she brought something that I never thought I'd see, a rubber bullet. And she picked it up off the street and she said, I'd bring it home to Limerick to show you what it's like, because you have no real comprehension. And we didn't really have any real comprehension, to be honest about it. We listened to RTE, it was single television land. We had one television station, because my father never allowed RTE2 on, even though we had RTE2 on. There's only dirt and filth in that thing. If the poor man could be alive for the dodgy box, I don't know what he'd say. So it was all RTE1 and it was all Radio 1. There was no local commercial radio stations. If you moved the dial in our house, you got Radio na Gaeltachta, which I never thought in a million years I'd be responsible for a couple of years after, which was all Radio 1, and it was all bad news. Our economy was in the jacks, and Northern Ireland was in a really bad place, and it looked like it was going to spill over. And then, realisation came about and pragmatism came about, and we had some really strong people who decided Not all politicians, some clerics as well, in both communities, that said, how many people does it have to us to be filmed taking them into graveyards before we realise this is not working, and that this kind of a meat churn of grief and blood is not going to get anybody anywhere, and nobody is going to win here. This is stalemate, and it's going to be stalemate in perpetuity until we decide we're going to do something different. And I think the two biggest decisions that were made in my life, anyway, from this jurisdiction's point of view, that were transformative, were first was the decision of Donogh O'Malley to allow people like me to go to school for free. Imagine, you say that these days now and people look at you like you've 10 heads. But up until Donogh O'Malley was a good Limerick man, different party, but we're in government together now, so I can't say anything bad about them. Up until he became Minister for Education, you had to pay to go to secondary. And it was an elitist thing. It was for the sons and daughters of farmers and business people. And it was a place that only the merchant classes of our provincial towns could go to, and the odd scholarship. And they were very odd because you had to be the brain box in the class. So certainly, if Donogh O'Malley hadn't made the decision that he made, I wouldn't have been able to go to secondary school, and let mine go to university on a county council grant. And the second thing that was really, I suppose, transformative for my generation was our entry into the European Economic Community. When we realised that we were no longer going to be this agrarian, inward-looking, isolated, protectionist, narky island on the west coast of Europe, but that we were going to become something at the centre. And I think it was that decision that actually led in many ways to the pragmatism that brought people to realise that this incessant killing and grief-stricken part of the northeast of our island needed something different. And I think probably, I've read a lot about him, and I had the fortune to meet him once or twice in Derry. I think it was John Hume's exposure to European politics, in the realisation that you could have Germans and French sitting down together in committees of the European Parliament, working together as European commissioners, and who only 25 or 30 years previously had been murdering each other and slaughtering each other at the rate of not in the tens or in the hundreds, but in the millions. And from my point of view, Ireland's accession to the European Economic Community has been singularly the most important thing that has happened this island ever. Because it gave us a realisation that there is a world beyond Ballymascanlon. There is a world beyond Newcastle West, which I actually, up until recently, would have not believed in, but there is. And there is places, that have a lot in common with us in the continent. We have more in common with than we realise. And while there are linguistic barriers, we have an awful lot in common with our partners in the European continent and the European mainland. And if they could come together to form, as John Bruton once upon a time said, the single greatest political experiment in peace in mankind, in the history of mankind, well then surely there was something we could learn from it here. And if you look at the devolved institutions and the East-West relationships and the North-South relationships, whether that's the Ministerial Council or the Council of the Isles or the British Irish Assembly or the North-South bodies, a lot of them take their genesis from European institutions. There's nobody really in charge, and everybody's in charge together. And it comes out of respect. And I think it was that concept and advent of respect that John Hume used to, every day, after the latest atrocity, he never looked for a head. He always looked for understanding. And he always looked for people to see the problem through the lens of the other person's eye. And when you're so far removed from the border and you're listening to this, you're thinking, God, is this man deluded? But he wasn't. He was actually being visionary in what kind of an island of Ireland that we could now be able to celebrate so many years on. And for a generation that are younger than me, thankfully, have never seen what it is to live without a dodgy box. And have never heard that there is this radio program called Morning Ireland. Most of them never listen to it, and never hear the atrocities one after another as you go to school in the morning. So much so that we were anaesthetised to it. We were anaesthetised to it. So if you look where we are now, and it's not perfect, and it's, we know that there are always challenges. It is a gazillion times better than it was. Watching on a Monday evening or Tuesday evening the latest funeral and the latest group of widows, the latest group of children, and to think now that we're in a situation where we're talking about investment, where we're talking about the challenges of money, where we're talking about things like, the All-Ireland Fund that has been established by this government, where we now have infrastructure in the north, including through my own department, that is being co-financed through the Department of Foreign Affairs, voted from my department into the Department of Foreign Affairs and given to research students, where we have a situation where we now have the universities north of the border, in collaboration with all of our universities south of the border, working in a cohesive fashion, where the main difficulties that I have now, as a very fortunate to be a minister in this government, is how much more money can we get, as opposed to the difficulties, say, that Albert Reynolds' government had at the time, which was, can we keep them inside the room, and can we keep them actually talking? And that's ultimately, where we have to get to as politicians. Where we have to get to as politicians is, yes, there are differences. We all have our differences. We have differences within our own government. There are people, within our own government who think that I'm some sort of a heretic when it comes to environmental issues, and there's others that probably agree with me. But there's also huge respect. And I think that that bedrock of respect that people like John Hume put the foundations in place for, and others, that have really given us that element of trust. Because without trust, I don't think we have any future whatsoever, either in this jurisdiction or on the island as a whole. And it's when trust breaks down, and it's when there's an element of distrust, and when people feel that they have been shafted, for want of a better word, that they begin to walk away. Or if they feel that there's one-upmanship, they begin to walk away. And the best route to make sure that that doesn't happen is through the medium of education. And it's through the medium of education from primary level, and I was a primary teacher myself for a while, you probably guessed that, up to tertiary and fourth level. That is where you will really instill trust. So from our point of view as a department, working with the Higher Education Authority, working with the North-South bodies, what I would love to be able to see is my children who are currently in the national school being able to look upon the universities north of the border as just as equal a place as they would look at the University of Limerick or MTU in Tralee or UCC, where I went myself. That they wouldn't look at this thing, this division thing when it comes to education, because education doesn't know boundaries. Education doesn't know, that the speed limit changes and all of a sudden it's in miles per hour as opposed to kilometres per hour, or that the distance is in miles, not in kilometres anymore. Education doesn't know that at all. What education knows is if there is a willing receptacle, a young person who wants to learn, that education is always available for them. And what it needs to thrive and survive, the oxygen of education, is money from the government. And that's where it really is so important for me in the couple of weeks ahead, with the budget now being finalised at the moment, that there is an emphasis now, thanks to the creation of the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. It's only taken me 6 months to get the title of it right. Since the advent of that and the separation of it from the Department of Education, whose primary responsibilities are to children in the primary school sector and children in secondary school, it has allowed us to do stuff that we could never have done before, because our resources were stripped and carved and pulled and dragged between 4 different distinct entities. So we now have a hugely important emphasis on apprenticeships that we never had before, and it's bearing fruit. Yesterday I announced 2 new veterinary colleges. We'll be announcing further improvements in the area of nursing, medicine, pharmacy, and the therapies, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and speech and language in the coming weeks and months. And we're doing that because of a strong economy, that we have resources to spend. And we have a strong economy with resources to spend because primarily we have peace on this island. And by the way, when we have peace on this island and our economy is growing so well, there is, I think, an incumbency upon us in the government in this jurisdiction to make sure that dividend, for want of a better word, is spread across the island, both in terms of infrastructure, like the narrow water bridge, but also in terms of education. So whether it's in the programs that we're doing with Queen's, or the University of Ulster, or other universities and other colleges that lie along the border, for me this is absolutely critical. Because the child is currently in junior infants in Ballian Arterig and Iarkiri has no concept or knowledge of the fact that once you go a couple of miles beyond Emyvale, you're in a different jurisdiction. To them, it's just an island that looks like a teddy bear, and that's the way it should be. To them, it doesn't really matter where they come from, whether the registration plate is yellow or white. It shouldn't matter, because education doesn't recognise it, and education doesn't see any benefit in that there being division. So we're working collaboratively with our colleagues north of the border. By the way, none of what I've said is in this so far. And the officials in the department love when I do this. We're working collaboratively with our colleagues north of the border, both in the departments of education and in the departments of the economy, and in other departments as well, and in the university sector and in the third level sector. We recognise, the northern jurisdiction has been, is now out of the European Union, and that provides, I suppose, challenges in terms of investment funds that are available for research from, the European investment funds that have been there, like innovation funds and everything else. And we have to work to see how we fill that gap. And how we fill that gap, I think you have seen the start of it already, a genesis of it already, with a new British government and a new kind of a restart, to be honest about it. Control-Alt-Delete has been pressed by Keir Starmer, which is a good thing, because anytime I ever ring the IT section, the first thing they say to me is, "Minister, did you turn it off and turn it on again?" So look, the relationship has been turned off and turned on again. And whatever the future has in terms of the political relationship with the European Union, that doesn't in any way change or any way deter the political relationship on the island from making sure that there are many, many ways, as my mother used to say, the large mercenary, there are many ways to kill a cat rather than choking it with butter. There are mechanisms and imaginative ways that we can get to make sure that what we all want to achieve, which is investment in education on the island, can be achieved in collaboration with the United States, with the European Union, with the southern government, with the northern government, and in collaboration as well, east-west. And it's my intention in the next couple of weeks to meet my opposite numbers, two of them in Westminster to do my job, to meet my opposite numbers in Westminster as well in the near future, to see how we can address this deficit. Because there is a problem, we need to recognise there is a problem, because, at the end of the day, the generation that they're all getting their news, not from Morning Ireland, aren't they so lucky, but they're all getting their news by scrolling. For them, 1995, 1994, 1985, 1984 is ancient history. It is parked somewhere in the book between the Stone Age and the Iron Age. It doesn't really matter to them. It's gone and it's dead. And to them, it's something that they will never revisit. Thanks be to God. But for them, we need to make sure that there isn't a bend in the road up ahead that takes them back into that. And the only way that we can keep moving forward is through education. It is through the mechanisms and the levers that are available to us as governments, as politicians, to make sure that young people are captured at an early stage and given opportunities that we never had. There was never a situation where you could do an apprenticeship in social work in Cork up to recently. There was never the tertiary offices and the routes into education that there are now in this state. For instance, if you don't get the points to become a doctor in your CAO, there are many, many other ways of doing it. When I did my Leaving Cert, there was two routes. That we either went the university route or you went the route, the God help us route. And that was a terrible indictment on the system. And to be honest about it, over the last number of years, Simon Harris in particular has really, I think, shown great leadership in terms of remodelling and re-identifying and reimagining what an apprentice looks like now. An apprentice, whether they come from Derry or whether they come from Donegal, they'll have the same opportunities. And we need to make sure that those opportunities are seamless and that those young men and women who are in primary schools today and those young children get an opportunity to have a good living, have their own home, have a job, rear a family and be happy in their communities, just when it comes to Ulster football final day and they all start to wear the tribal colours in again. But that's really what this should be about. And my job as Minister is to make sure that, you know, the stuff that we have been doing up to recently, like investing in university campus in Derry, that continues. Because the kids from, you know, Ballybuffet or Stranolar or Guidor or Mullan, they don't recognise that there's a boundary that they're crossing. They recognise that this is their regional urban centre, this is their city, this is their regional city. Why wouldn't they go to university there? Why wouldn't they go to university there when the next nearest city that might be available to do a course is, you know, 4 or 5 hour bus journey away to Dublin? So why wouldn't you go to your regional city in Derry? And that's something that, to be honest about it, when I was crossing the border as a child in the back seat of a Renault 18 being stopped north of Dundalk or south of Dundalk for hours on end, wanting to know, and my mother being asked, how many pounds of butter have you, ma'am? You know, that was not a concept that we could ever imagine. My own sister went to university in Aberdeen, again in the 1980s. That would have been unheard of. You went to the universities which were small in number, the traditional ones, as they like to call themselves, word I'm not really happy with, we have to find a different word for it, and they were limited in numbers. And if you were children of the merchant classes or the farming classes, you got to go. And if you didn't, you got Slattery's bus from Newcastle West to Rosslare and on to Fishguard, and you worked in a building site in London, or you did some domestic work if you were a woman. We've changed utterly since then. Thanks be to God we've changed. But there's more that we need to do. And the strategies and plans that we have laid out in the Department of Research, Innovation and Science with our colleagues in the Higher Education Authority and others like Soares are going to be the guiding principles in which we'll invest. And we'll work with the Centre for Cross-Border Studies. We'll work with all of the universities, all of the colleges, our counterparts north of the border, and our colleagues in the United Kingdom to make sure that whatever political decisions have been taken in the recent past, that they should not in any way discommode the children who are in the national schools or those children who are yet to be born. Education does not recognise boundaries. Education does not recognise that some countries are in and other countries are out of the European Union. And I think that the mechanism that the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach have used recently to restart the relationship is timely for your 25th anniversary, because it can also restart, I think, a dialogue and a discussion around education in its entirety, from the moment that the child comes into the world until they leave with their postdoctorate qualification on the island. And certainly as a department and as a government, we're up for that, and I look forward to playing my part in that. With your cooperation, I think there's a lot we can achieve in this space. So Rish, William of Wiacus Goaldi of Galer, Asoktan Kura, Agus Gonairi Gogala, Gurmil Magav.
We've got 20 minutes, haven't we? Yeah. Okay, folks, we have a few minutes before coffee break. The Minister very kindly is very open to taking some questions from the floor. So stick your hand up if you want to ask a question or make a point to the Minister. Don't be shy. It's the first one that's the most difficult. You'll be admired and respected by everybody in the room if you're the first to put your hand up.
That's a lie. I'll write your name down.
And if nobody does, I'm going to pick on somebody.
Question
Yes.
over here.
Question over there and then a question here.
Minister Orla Flynn, President of Atlantic Technological University, and I just firstly want to thank you and your department and Department of Agriculture. The news yesterday of the veterinary education coming to the northwest of the country, I think will be welcomed very much by everybody here. And to think that you can have medical education and veterinary medicine education in the northwest of the island is something that I think will help with your agenda of breaking down those borders. And just wondering whether there are any other initiatives on the horizon that would better support mobility for staff and students to share each other's skills facilities, and to get to know each other a little bit better. Thank you.
We're going to take a couple or three questions at a time. So there was another one here.
Minister John Doyle from Dublin City University. Again, thank you for your words today and your support ongoing for both the Centre and the wider agenda of cross-border cooperation. You alluded in the early part of your speech to the sort of the HA North-South research scheme of some years ago. It's been sort of at the time there was thoughts there might be a second round of that at some stage, and there's been some discussions on that. And I wonder, are we in a position to give us any update on that, whether that's still on the planning, or whether you're going to go a different direction in terms of those resources?
Mm-hmm. Minister, do you want to respond to those? If anybody else wants to ask, put your hand up.
So, first of all, Orla, I agree entirely with you with regard to, there was a number of courses in traditional courses, the kind of vocational ones, medicine, veterinary, teaching, pharmacy, that were kind of the confines of, for up to many years, they were the confines of Dublin. We're a country now with a diverse population. We look different, we are different, we sound different. Compared to Ireland in 1988, when I was in the national school, we now sound different. Our surnames are different, and it's a great thing. I often hear this Kent, Ireland is full. It is. It's full of hypocrites, because we have these people that have no difficulty in walking Fifth Avenue to celebrate migration and to celebrate the fact that millions of us were driven out of Ireland during the famine. And then they drag out the tricolour as a weapon of hatred against people who were escaping exactly the same thing some 200 years later. So Ireland is different now. And So it is different, and it should be different. And in that difference, the places where we study should look different. And that's why our technological universities are different. They're different for a reason. Many of them are amalgams of what were originally regional technical colleges. They went on to become IoTs. And by the way, when the regional technical colleges were established, they were revolutionary as well, because you brought third-level education into towns that never had a third-level presence, like Letterkenny and Tralee and others. And now they're university towns. And so in a university, universities should be able to offer disciplines and faculties across the spectrum. And whether that's veterinary or medicine or pharmacy or nursing or dentistry or civil engineering or whatever it is, I don't have this transfixed view that it's only a number of what are called, the established ones. If that was the case, there would only be, the main discipline courses would only be available in Trinity, because then you had the Queen's universities, Cork, Galway and Belfast that came on some hundreds of years later. And I'm sure when they came on, there was probably a lot of heck saying, oh, this will never work. And then DCU and UL came on, and they were the NIHEs. And one of the first graduates out of NIHE Limerick is the current Chancellor of the University, Bridget Laffin. And when the University of Limerick was being upgraded to a university, like in the minds of some of the academic commentators, like the world was going to fall in on itself. Imagine Limerick is going to have a university; it's going to be a disgrace. Could you? And it was absolutely shock horror. And then when Limerick had the audacity to look for medicine and got graduate entry medicine, it was a case of like, well, that'll never work. And it has worked and has been hugely successful. And I have no doubt as well that, in the transformation of education, which needs to be constant, if our education system isn't constantly evolving and constantly being challenged and constantly being pushed into a situation where it needs to change, if you allowed stagnation in, you can be guaranteed that you're on a surefire way to failure. And that's why I think that the TUs will really put it up to the third level sector in Ireland, across the island. And I don't mean this just in a jurisdictional issue. I mean across the island in terms of what they can do, what they are doing, and what they will do. John, just in relation to research, look, we have a new research body that I've just given a commencement to, Research Ireland, Taillon. It got off to a bit of a difficult start, but it's there in place now, and you're all somehow connected to education, in terms of your individual organisations or in terms of your supports that you give to students and universities, and even within your own organisations, having people working on research projects. I would really encourage people to knuckle down with Research Ireland, with Taillon, as soon as possible. I have given them a kind of a carte blanche with regard to how research needs to be promulgated into the future, how it needs to be advanced, and I'm not putting any boundaries on it. There's a new board, new CEO, new chair, and I really think that, like, you know, for this small country on the western fringes of Europe, we have to, if we don't come together and pull together on this, we're going to find ourselves being quickly irrelevant. And I don't think that that should be at the expense of one discipline or another. I think that there will be plenty for people to go around, and I know that there was concern, you know, are you going to leave out the humanities by filling it with people like yourself, you're, you know, all scientists? That's not what this is about. This is about bringing value to the future by researchers of today having that access to an agency that will support them, and I think the university sector and the semi-state sector will find Taillon to be a very good vehicle, not only in terms of internally within our own jurisdiction, but as well as that reaching out to the other jurisdictions on these islands.